There's no doubt that the pharmaceutical industry very deliberately used this idea of depression being caused by a chemical imbalance in order to promote the SSRI antidepressants. Had they been told that actually there wasn't a chemical imbalance, this had not been demonstrated, and we don't know what the drugs do or how exactly they're altering your brain, they would never have taken them. Some of whom were angry that they had been misled into taking antidepressants in the first place. What we're doing is we're introducing foreign chemicals into a very delicate system, and we are discovering years later that that has all sorts of untoward consequences.
Dr. Joanna Moncrieff is one of the world's leading critical psychiatrists and the woman shaking the foundations of modern mental health. She's the co-author of the landmark 2022 review that dismantled the serotonin chemical imbalance theory of depression, a myth that sold billions of pills and shaped decades of treatment. She's the author of The Myth of the Chemical Cure and Chemically Imbalanced. She's become a fearless voice exposing how Big Pharma convinced millions to swallow SSRIs without truly knowing how they work. At this point, you might rightly ask that if they're working and they give people relief, why is it so important that we understand how they work? And it's a really good question. It's complicated and we get into a lot of it during this episode. But I, for one, really believe that if there are companies making billions of dollars off of these drugs, that perhaps they should spend less money advertising and marketing them and convincing people that they should take them, and more money figuring out what the fuck they actually do. That cannot be controversial. Anyways, subscribe to the channel. This is a really good episode. Leave your comments down below. Enjoy.
The brain is a very complex organ. We don't understand very well how it works in the first place, and we certainly don't understand all the consequences of putting in foreign chemicals. There are lots and lots of placebo-controlled trials, and they show that overall antidepressants are a little bit better than a placebo, but the difference is very small, probably clinically meaningless, i.e. not noticeable. Surveys suggest that about half of people taking antidepressants are reporting that they have emotional blunting of some sort or another. Antidepressants, particularly SSRIs, are well recognized to cause sexual dysfunction. There are different estimates about the prevalence of this. Some people suggest that almost everyone gets it to some degree or another, but surveys have suggested that up to about 60% of people might be experiencing this. One of the problems with how we've been thinking about depression is we think of it as a condition, and we try and treat the condition rather than try and help the individual.
Dr. Joanna Moncrieff, I asked ChatGPT to critically assess the evidence that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance of serotonin. That was the exact prompt I gave it. What do you think it told me?
Oh, interesting. I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing it said that this is a common belief. It may have said that it's been challenged recently. I don't know. I'd be very interested to hear. Did it?
Yeah, you might be quite pleased by its response. Actually, I was quite surprised. So it gave some backstory. It said that the origin dates back to the 1960s, 1970s. Observations that SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, will go into a lot about what they are, like Prozac, seemed to elevate serotonin and seemed to elevate or alleviate depressive symptoms. It said decreased tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin, could induce low moods, so another observational point, and that post-mortem and CSF cerebrospinal fluid studies again associated low serotonin with people who died by suicide or had depression. So a lot of observational data. But then it said a landmark 2022 paper, umbrella review by Moncrieff et al., published in Molecular Psychiatry, concluded that there is no consistent evidence of an association between serotonin and depression. And there's no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lowered serotonin activity or concentrations. So ChatGPT is echoing your viewpoint. It's a flag bearer for your mission, which
Right.
I was quite surprised by. There's so much misinformation about depression online, and your review has been so impactful that ChatGPT is actually putting that right at the top of its response. So that's got to feel good.
That's really good to know, because someone contacted me just yesterday, actually, to say that they were shocked and worried because the psychology A-level exam continues to contain questions about the neurochemistry of depression and other psychiatric disorders, as if these have been, clearly demonstrated.
Right. What did compel you to challenge that standard narrative? Maybe give some context to the lead up to that paper, your career. What were some of the big moments that kind of led you to challenge what is a sensitive topic, but obviously an incredibly important one?
So I suppose there are two main things. So for a long time, I've been questioning the conventional understanding of psychiatric medication. And by that, I mean the idea that psychiatric drugs like antidepressants or antipsychotics, or any of the other drugs that we use for mental health problems, work by targeting an underlying biological mechanism that leads to the symptoms of the condition. And I've been saying that there's another much more plausible, in my view, way of understanding what these drugs do. And that's the idea that far from targeting and correcting an underlying mechanism or abnormality, they actually induce an altered brain state, which alters thinking and feelings and behavior sometimes as well. This is the way that we understand drugs like alcohol and cannabis to work. We understand that if you have a drink of alcohol, you feel different, and your mood may temporarily be lifted if you're down in the dumps, for example, or if you're very anxious, you may temporarily feel more relaxed. And that's not because the alcohol is targeting the underlying mechanisms of depression or anxiety. It's because the characteristic alterations induced by alcohol include are superimposed onto our underlying feelings, and include feelings of euphoria and relaxation.
Big difference between the two.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that drugs like antidepressants or antipsychotics are the same as alcohol or cannabis or heroin or any of these other things. Of course, they're not, but they're the same to the extent that they change the normal state of the brain. They alter our brain chemistry and therefore create mental alterations in our mental experience and thought processes, etc. And so that's been my thinking about psychiatric drugs. And so for that reason, I have always been skeptical of the idea that what they are doing is targeting a serotonin imbalance, and always been interested in where that idea has come from and what is supporting it exactly. And I became aware in the noughties, probably in the late 90s, that actually there was really very little evidence to support this idea that serotonin is caused by that depression is caused by a serotonin deficiency. And I also was aware that actually more and more doctors and academics were becoming aware of this too, who specialized in research in this area. But the general public, on the other hand, were becoming more and more convinced that it was true because of big promotional campaigns that had been undertaken by Big Pharma, for example. And so I wanted to find some way of getting across to the general public that this idea was questionable and was just an idea, and that the evidence was not convincing. And there was nowhere else in the literature where you could go to say, okay, this is a good overview of all the research on serotonin and depression. So that's when I decided to get a little team together and to do that, to bring together all the areas of modern research on serotonin and depression to look at their findings and draw an overall conclusion on the state of the evidence for links between serotonin and depression.
Is it a little suspicious that there wasn't a review done? Does it kind of show the power and influence that big pharma have, not just on our healthcare system but also on academia? Like, if you were realizing this in 1990, your review came out in 2022, how could it be the case that nobody else thought to do that review? Do you think that's a little bit suspicious on the side of big pharma maybe having an influence?
So I should, to be fair, there have been some other reviews,
Okay.
but they haven't been comprehensive or systematic reviews
Okay.
of the literature. And one of the simple explanations for that is there is an awful lot of research. And for that reason, we did what's called an umbrella review. So we looked at all the systematic reviews and meta-analyses in the different areas of research that we looked at, rather than going to all the individual studies, because that just would have taken forever. So
Right.
there have been one or two non-systematic reviews, which interestingly have come to the same conclusions, but no big systematic review. But you're absolutely right that no one has chosen to do this before. No funder had highlighted, look, this is a real gap in the evidence base. We need to do this. So no one had said, look, we need to set up a study on this. We'll fund this. And no groups of researchers had decided spontaneously to do this either. And I think that is no coincidence. I think that reflects the attachment of the psychiatric profession to the idea that depression is can be understood as a neurochemical abnormality, and their reluctance to challenge that idea, even when they know or suspect that the evidence for it is not strong.
Yeah. What was the response to the paper overall? I mean, again, clearly incredibly impactful. One of the most cited papers of all time, I believe, incredibly well spread and distributed. What was the overall response?
So the response was really interesting. So initially, the public and the media were really interested, surprised, shocked, and in some cases upset by it.
Yeah.
So
rightfully so.
Yeah, so I got responses from people who were using or had used antidepressants, some of whom were angry with us for publishing because they felt they'd made a decision to take this medication and they didn't want their decision questioned or want to have to question their decision. But some of whom were angry that they had been misled into taking antidepressants in the first place, and
Right.
said that had they been told that actually there wasn't a chemical imbalance, this had not been demonstrated, and we don't know what the drugs do or how exactly they're altering your brain, they would never have taken them in the first place. So we had those sort of two contrasting responses from members of the general public, and just a lot of shock and surprise in the media that something that people believed had been scientifically demonstrated turned out not to be so. And
Right.
also that it turned out that people in the medical profession and the research community had known this for a long time. That also, surprised and upset some people. And that became apparent because from the day that we published it, psychiatric experts were lined up to, so-called experts were lined up to tell people that the paper wasn't really important because we'd known this all along.
Wow.
So in some ways that made it even more shocking to people who felt that they should have been told. If you'd known this all along that this wasn't true, then why didn't you tell people that it wasn't the case? And why were people still being told on national television and radio, for example, that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance just weeks before our paper was published?
Completely blew my mind. I have to believe that the latter camp of people that were upset at big pharma and not upset at you were the vast majority of people. Like, I can only imagine how betrayed those people felt. Almost a very large proportion of them would have suffered bad side effects of being on the medication. It would have influenced their lives. And from what I can see from reading your book and your work and overall, mostly negative. I know lots of positives as well, but how betrayed they must have felt. I'm lucky enough for whatever reason to I've never really been predisposed to that much negative emotion. It's never really been a big part of my life, and maybe we can get into later of why that is, but it's just insane that more people weren't outraged, and that anyone could have been upset with you for just exposing the truth and shining the flashlight, because it's just an insane, people put their faith in an institution and they completely betrayed them, and it seems like they purposely did so.
Yeah.
Like, they can't have been pulling the wool over their own eyes so much that they didn't also know the science.
So I was deeply disappointed by the reaction of the psychiatric profession in particular. Some psychiatrists had actually said a few years earlier things when people had mentioned previously that this idea was not, this theory of the serotonin theory of depression was not supported by evidence. Some psychiatrists had mentioned then, had said, we use it as a metaphor, and we just think it's helpful to give patients some indication that depression is a brain-based disorder, even though they were also acknowledging that the evidence for that wasn't there. So psychiatrists had been saying for a while that they do mislead the public. And in my view, their response to the paper was an effort to stifle discussion and to stop people asking too many questions about antidepressants. And they kept, many leading psychiatrists kept saying things like, it doesn't matter how antidepressants work, it just matters that they work, which I think is an absurd thing to say. It matters very much whether they are, numbing your emotions a bit like alcohol might change your emotions, or whether they're targeting some underlying abnormality. That those are two very different scenarios, which will lead to people making very different decisions. So I was really disappointed by the reaction of my fellow psychiatrists and shocked by it. I was sympathetic to those people who are using antidepressants who were challenged by the findings, because I think that they'd been given this misinformation that they had a chemical imbalance in the brain, and many people have then sort of reconstructed their identity on the basis of that misinformation. So they've come to believe that they are someone who has flawed brain chemistry and that that's part of who they are. Right. And in many cases, I expect that those people didn't really want to believe that in the first place and had to sort of persuade themselves that that was the case. And then to be told, actually, you were right all along, it wasn't the case. I think I can understand how that was very difficult for some people, and and they were really upset by it. So I wasn't particularly surprised by that reaction. I think that's understandable and just a consequence of the extent of misinformation that has been put out there.
Right. I think the only tiny correction that I would make is that it doesn't seem like misinformation to me. It seems like disinformation. The difference being that this is a purposeful campaign of knowing the information you're spreading is false on the side of Big Pharma. So it's not that they've got it wrong, because if anyone's an expert on the research being done, it's them. They hire, they pay the best money for the best scientists and run the clinical trials. Like, they have the absolute best data set on determining the efficacy of these drugs. Right. I mean, and for them not to make any of that information clear, but the opposite of that, to create marketing campaigns and advertising campaigns. And this whole idea of advertising pharmaceutical therapeutics is just a strange one to me entirely. But it just seems like a disinformation campaign, a purposeful attempt at deceiving the population to a level that's almost like hard for me to believe, to a level that it kind of challenges my faith in humanity, sort of thing. It's really quite horrid.
Absolutely. And I think there's no doubt that the pharmaceutical industry very deliberately used this idea of depression being caused by a chemical imbalance in order to promote the SSRI antidepressants. And the particular benefit of this idea back in the 1990s, when these drugs first came in, is that the use of psychoactive substances for emotional problems had come into disrepute at that time because of the revelations that benzodiazepines, which were the widely used drugs at that time, caused physical dependence and
Right.
withdrawal effects that could be really challenging, and some people couldn't manage to get off them even. And so the pharmaceutical industry wanted to distance their new range of drugs from the benzodiazepines, and this idea that what they were doing was targeting some underlying abnormality, i.e. a chemical imbalance or a serotonin deficiency, enabled them to position the SSRIs as proper medical treatments and distinguish them from the nasty benzodiazepines, which were just like recreational drugs, had just numbed people, zombified people a little bit, and therefore weren't proper targeted treatments in that way. So I agree with you. I think that was a deliberate campaign, deliberately engineered to overcome people's reluctance to take psychoactive drugs for emotional problems. The way that the pharmaceutical industry presented this information, I should just comment on. So in many instances, in many advertisements or information on websites, that sort of thing, it will be said that it will be put something like this: depression may be caused by a deficiency of serotonin. Research suggests that depression may be caused by. So it is often caveated, but the point is that it was said so many times,
they know what they're doing,
so forcefully that people skipped over the may and didn't realize that actually what they were saying is, yeah, it may be, but it may not be. we don't have any evidence, and in some instances they do just say much more directly, depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. So I think the pharmaceutical industry were, as you say, deliberately trying to inculcate this idea into people. The medical profession have at worst colluded with that, at best not come out and exposed it. So, lots of doctors have been telling patients, you have a chemical imbalance. This is why you need to take an antidepressant. That certainly has happened. But there are other doctors who may just say, the treatment for this is an antidepressant, without explaining that we don't know that you have an underlying chemical imbalance. There's no evidence for that idea. These drugs change normal brain chemistry, and that's another way that they could be working. So I think there's disinformation, as you say, on the part of the pharmaceutical industry, and a mixture of motivations from the medical profession, passive and less passive promotion of this idea.
How does, for people that aren't that clear, me included, how does the relationship between healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry really work? What are the incentives on the side of doctors in terms of prescribing different medication, in terms of making particular diagnoses? Like, maybe explain some of the influences that occur in that bidirectional relationship and the biases that it creates.
So it varies by country, and in the UK and Europe, the pharmaceutical industry are not allowed to advertise directly to patients.
Yes.
But they advertise to doctors and healthcare providers. And so when a new range of drugs is produced, typically there will be glossy pamphlets scattered around your workplace. There'll be mugs with the drug's name on. There'll be little post-it notes with the drug's name on. There'll be calendars. There'll be drug reps hanging around visiting you to talk about the new drugs. There will be lunches put on that are sponsored by a pharmaceutical industry with an industry speaker who comes along and presents the research on their new products. or something relating to that. Sometimes those speakers are people from the company. Sometimes they are regular doctors who are being paid by the company to come and speak. That always adds a bit of credibility. The person speaking is is a practicing psychiatrist who works down the road from you, or an academic at a university. And then they have a heavy presence at conferences, lots of stands, lots of advertising at conferences. And so really it's the technique is flooding, I would say. You're just flooded as a doctor. You're just flooded with this information, and there's no one around to say, hang on a minute. Might there be another way of looking at this? Might there be some problems? Might it not be as rosy as they're depicting? The other big issue, of course, is that they fund most drug research, and they certainly fund all the early studies on new drugs. And so, they're doing big, impressive studies with lots of people, so they get published in good journals, and people who might have a more independent point of view are not getting the funding, certainly at that time, to run comparable sort of trials. If trials done by independent academics ever get done, they usually get done sort of years later when the drugs are already established. And so they set the agenda. They do the research, they set the agenda, and then they flood their market, which is doctors and health professionals in UK and Europe. It also includes patients in countries like the US and New Zealand, where there's direct-to-consumer advertising. They flood their audience with material telling them how great these products are. That depression is a chemical imbalance and can be rectified by, just happens that it can be rectified by our new substance.
It's astounding, isn't it? It's really quite shocking to me that any human adult with 2 brain cells can look at that system and be like, yeah, I think that's a good system. I think it should work that way. I don't think there's any incentives that are misplaced. I don't think there's any bias here. I think that's a well-functioning system. It kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. We should not be, in my view, we shouldn't be organising any branch of healthcare according to the imperatives of commercial providers of drugs or whatever else, and certainly not mental health care, which is so subjective and therefore even more open to distortion and misinformation than other areas of healthcare might be. Although there are lots of problems in other areas of healthcare with pharma activities as well, but mental health is definitely an area that's ripe for misinformation and disinformation, distortion of evidence, and that sort of thing.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. I also bought one for my girlfriend, and she also loves it. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really, really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep, so this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal, ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable. Literally is just a really high quality, well-made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more.
I should add maybe that
Please.
The situation has improved a bit since the noughties and since the big advertising campaigns for antidepressants and SSRIs started. So in the early noughties, the British Medical Journal, led by then editor Richard Smith, really started to highlight this situation of the corruption of medicine by the pharmaceutical industry, ran a series of very impressive, interesting articles and critical articles about this situation, and started to sort of reset the agenda, I would say, a bit. And since then, the situation is a little better. If you go to a standard psychiatric conference now, there are still drug companies present, but they are at least mainly contained in sort of one area and not floating around everywhere.
Right.
Declarations of interest are enforced much more rigorously nowadays. So if you're doing a talk at a conference, it would be clear whether you're being funded by Eli Lilly or whoever it is. And declarations of interest on papers are, again, have got much more consistent and reliable. So there have been improvements.
Okay.
But it's still fundamentally the same system where there are for-profit companies manufacturing drugs that it's in their interest to sell,
right,
and it's not in their interest to probe too much into their adverse effects or certainly into any long-term effects.
Right. It was a very low bar, so it's not much to say that there's improvements. If it gotten worse or stayed even the same, that would be pretty indefensible and horrendous. Let's get specific about the details. What exactly is an SSRI, and what does the best clinical trial data say about its efficacy?
So an SSRI is a drug that inhibits the serotonin transporter protein. And that is the protein that among other things, and that's the protein that transports serotonin out of the gap between the nerve cells where it has its action into the nerve cell body where it's not active anymore. And so if you inhibit that transporter protein, the idea is that serotonin will stay around in that area for longer and therefore be more active, have a more powerful effect. So that's the theory behind what SSRIs do. There are some indications that in the short term, they probably boost serotonin function in some ways. But in the long term, there's some evidence that maybe they reduce serotonin levels. And overall, I would say that we're really unsure about quite what SSRIs are doing at the biochemical level in the brain. They are drugs that have quite subtle mental effects. Most of the serotonin is in our gut. Only a small amount is in our brain. So it's not like the mental effects they have are not like when you have a drink of alcohol, when it's very noticeable that, your brain's changed, your mental state has changed. But they do have subtle effects on our mental states. Some of them make people feel a bit lethargic and a bit groggy, a bit of brain fog. Some more than others, I should say. And most of them seem to make people a bit emotionally numb. So to numb both positive and negative emotions. And people who are on antidepressants, for example, often say that they can't cry. And when people are coming off antidepressants, they'll often, in reverse, become very tearful, like they get a sort of rebound effect and get super intense emotions, including tearfulness. So that's what they are as drugs. And then the question is, are they better than a placebo in randomized clinical trials, or better than other things that other ways that we might help people with depression? There are lots and lots of placebo-controlled trials, and they show that that overall antidepressants are a little bit better than a placebo. But the difference is very small. On average, it's 2 points on the 52-point Hamilton rating scale for depression. And any attempt to define what a meaningful difference is on this scale puts it at higher than 2 points. So the difference is probably clinically meaningless, i.e. not noticeable. But it's not necessarily a real pharmacological effect either, because there are various biases that are still present in those findings. And one of those is that people who are enrolled in these trials are often able to guess more likely than you would expect them to whether they're getting the real drug or the placebo. And that means these drugs aren't fully double-blind. Right. And we make them double-blind because we know that what people think they're taking, whether people think they're taking the real drug or the placebo, has a strong influence on people's outcomes, on people's immediate outcomes. So you can show in some trials where there's actually hasn't been any difference between antidepressants and placebo, they've asked people to guess what they're taking, and the people who guess they're taking the antidepressant do a lot better than the people who guess they're taking placebo, regardless of what they're taking. So that's not a consequence of a real effect, because these trials were negative anyway, and it just demonstrates that there is a strong influence of our expectations on our underlying feelings.
Yes.
Most people go into these trials hoping that they'll get the real drug and hoping that it will be helpful for them. And therefore, if they think they have got the real drug, if they're getting a dry mouth or feeling a little bit groggy, they'll feel more optimistic about their chances of doing well. And of course, depression is associated with pessimism and hopelessness. So if you feel more optimistic, you will by definition be doing better than someone who is feeling less optimistic.
Right.
So I've referred to this situation and this effect as the amplified placebo effect. So I believe that the small difference that we see between antidepressants and placebos in randomized controlled trials is probably the result of an amplified placebo effect caused by the fact that people, in many trials, not in all, but in many trials, are able to identify whether they're getting the real drug or the placebo. So that's the situation. What I generally say is that these, if I'm talking with a patient about the possibility of taking an antidepressant, that these are drugs that numb emotions, and therefore, in theory, they may reduce the intensity of your negative feelings, whether that's feelings of sadness or anxiety or whatever it is. In practice, it seems from the randomized controlled trials that this numbing effect is not really very useful and doesn't add up to any greater effect than you would actually get from taking a placebo.
Has there been much research done that was very well covered, I think, across the bases? Has there been good research on what is happening in the brain in this SSRI-induced apathy, where it seems to just get the emotional spectrum and then lob the ends off? So you're kind of just stuck in the middle. That you don't have the highs, you don't have the lows. You're just kind of in a neutral, sort of neutered state. Do we know what's happening in the brain when this happens? Has there been, you have to assume there's been some good research directly on this.
The short answer is no. And there hasn't been any good research or even much bad research on this, because there's been a complete lack of interest in it.
That's just crazy, isn't
it? Mainstream psychopharmacology researchers mostly don't even acknowledge that the drugs cause emotional blunting and are certainly not interested in it, other than, they might regard it as a sort of incidental side effect, as a bit of a nuisance. But to them, they believe that the drugs are targeting some sort of mechanism, probably to do with serotonin, although not a straightforward deficiency or imbalance. And therefore, they don't regard this effect as important or interesting or worthy of investigation. There have been a few studies asking people about the experience, both qualitative and quantitative studies. So those are out there, and those have been very useful. And some of those have been done by people who have also done more conventional research into antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs. But there haven't been any studies that I know of that have attempted to link this with what is actually going on in the brain.
It's a bit gross, isn't it? Like, all you have to do is talk to people that are taking antidepressants. And this is, at least from my perspective, the thing that you hear almost ubiquitously is, yeah, I don't feel as intensely down, but I don't feel great either. I don't really have motivation. Like, I'm kind of content sitting on the couch, but it's kind of a bubble wrapped existence. It's not, it doesn't really feel like living. And I refuse to believe the pharmaceutical companies don't have a very, very good idea of that. Do we know what rough percentage of, first off, what percentage of people are taking SSRIs, and then maybe what percentage of them suffer the side effects such as apathy? And maybe we can go into the other one, the big one, which is sexual dysfunction, which is another huge one.
Yeah. So a lot of people are taking antidepressants. It's almost 1 in 5 people, about 17%, according to figures which are a bit old now, admittedly, from 2017. And almost 1 in 4 women were reported as taking them in 2022 or 2023 by the BBC when they made a documentary, and they got that data from official sources. So yeah, 23% of women, almost 1 in 4 women.
Staggering. It's so much higher than if I didn't know anything and someone would just get, because again, I've been lucky and kind of blessed my whole life to it's just, I've never really suffered anything that I would even consider depression beyond like 2 or 3 days at a time, I think, as a blessing. I would never have guessed 23%.
Yeah.
Like, my naive sense would have been like 5%. I don't know.
So I remember doing a debate about this about 10 years ago, and people were shocked then that about 1 in 10 were taking antidepressants, and now it's almost double that.
Right.
I mean, it's incredible. And really shocking. So those are the proportions of people. The proportion of people who get emotional blunting, there have been some surveys. Surveys always have limitations because you're never quite sure who's answering them. But the survey suggests that about half of people taking antidepressants are reporting that they have emotional blunting of some sort or another.
Wow. And then would you know about, do you want to go into sexual dysfunction as well, which
yes.
is sort of the...
So it's, I think it's important to say that it's probably linked, that emotional numbing and sexual dysfunction are probably 2 sides of the same effect of these drugs.
Right.
I did some research a few years ago that showed that people who are reporting one are reporting the other, and that's been shown subsequently as well. And so antidepressants, particularly SSRIs, are well recognized to cause sexual dysfunction. There are different estimates about the prevalence of this. Some people suggest that almost everyone gets it to some degree or another who takes one of the SSRIs. But surveys have suggested that up to about 60% of people might be experiencing this effect. it's usually thought that surveys and research underestimate sexual side effects because people are, embarrassed about reporting them.
Right.
So I think we can confidently say that a high proportion of people who take SSRIs and SNRIs get sexual side effects, and probably a slightly lower proportion of people who take other sorts of antidepressants. Now, the reason that it's probably associated with the emotional numbing is twofold. The sexual side effects can include all sorts of things. They can include erectile dysfunction, difficulties, delayed orgasm, or difficulties having an orgasm. They also are typically manifested in reduction in genital sensitivity. So there seems to be a numbing and anesthetic effect on the genitals.
Wow.
And in a reduction of libido. So that reduction of genital sensitivity and reduction of libido obviously map onto, or you can see how they might well be associated with some emotional numbing effect. It seems like these drugs have a general numbing effect on emotions and sexual feelings as well.
Right.
And the most worrying aspect of this is that these effects may be persistent. So it's the fact that SSRIs cause sexual dysfunction is well recognized, well accepted. That's not at all controversial. It's been recognized for a long time. It had always been assumed that it would go away when the drugs were stopped. What is emerging now is that for some people, even when they have stopped their antidepressant, they are still experiencing sexual dysfunction, including this loss of libido and reduced genital sensitivity. And for some people, it can persist for many years. So this is really, really worrying, and really worrying in view of the fact that not only are almost 1 in 5 of the population taking antidepressants, more and more young people are starting to take antidepressants. And I'm very concerned that this effect is not flagged up enough to people, particularly the potential persistence of sexual dysfunction. There was a recent survey done in Canada, very interesting survey, of young people with some sort of gender or sexual atypicality, and so it was a survey that wasn't focusing on antidepressants or sexual functioning in particular at all. It was focusing on people's feelings about their gender identity and sexuality, but it did coincidentally ask people about taking antidepressants and whether they'd experienced any sexual side effects. And in that study, 13% of people reported persistent sexual dysfunction after stopping their antidepressants, compared to only 1% who reported it after stopping other sorts of drugs, other sorts of mental health drugs. So that survey suggests that this could be quite a common problem, which is really worrying.
It's staggering how much we don't know. Like, I remember learning about SSRIs in college, and the way it was kind of marketed to me was, we're not quite sure the role of serotonin in depression. It might be there. It might have a very large effect. It might have a very small effect. There's a lot of mysteries with SSRIs. Like, we don't know why it takes multiple weeks for them to work, even though there's I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but good evidence that it probably does boost serotonin within only a few hours. So the fact that it takes weeks to have the efficacious effect of it is kind of, again, signal at least that serotonin and depression, it's not so simple as just a chemical imbalance, as you say. But 20% of populations are on something, and there's so many things going on that we have no idea. Like, multi-year long physiological adaptation is what's required for sexual dysfunction to last that long, right? That's long-lasting physiological adaptation.
Yeah.
Again, yeah. I've said things are astounding a lot, but it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Another thing that didn't make sense was, I was looking at the dates that these drugs were invented. So Prozac was invented in 1972, Zoloft in the 1970s, citalopram 1980s. Have we discovered an antidepressant from this millennia? Like, isn't that another fact that's just a bit stunning?
Um, the SNRIs and mirtazapine and vortioxetine have all come on. They've all been introduced more recently. I couldn't tell you exactly when they were developed, but there are some more recent products. But just let me go back to what you were saying before,
Please.
then, because I think that's important. We are putting foreign chemicals into the brain when we take a drug that crosses the blood-brain barrier, like an antidepressant, and the brain is a very complex organ. We don't understand very well how it works in the first place, and we certainly don't understand all the consequences of putting in foreign chemicals, and persistent sexual dysfunction, emotional dampening, dependence. All these are consequences of doing this that we did not foresee, because we didn't appreciate the gravity of what we were doing when we were, when we were developing these drugs. We had this, we being the scientific community, including pharma, had this simplistic idea that, depression has some sort of, simple, specific biochemical mechanism, and we can put in a chemical to tweak it in one way or another, and that's going to be fine. We're not doing that at all. We don't know if there's any mechanism. We don't know if it even makes sense to talk in that way of depression having an underlying biological mechanism. What we're doing is we're introducing foreign chemicals into a very delicate system, and we are discovering years later that has, all sorts of untoward consequences, and we shouldn't be surprised, or we shouldn't be surprised if we appreciate how complex the brain is and how little we know about what we're actually doing when we fiddle about with our brain chemistry in this way.
Right. What, in your view, is depression? How do you explain it to people? If people are listening to this podcast and they've had this serotonin, or maybe they don't even know the word serotonin, but it was just some sort of chemical imbalance, some biologically rooted imbalance in their brain. What way do you explain to people what depression is? What's the right way to think about it in your view?
So depression is a mood or emotion, and human moods or emotions are by definition reactions to our circumstances. So that means that you have to understand something like depression at the level of the person. It's not something that we can understand by looking inside the brain. It's something that we have to understand as a meaningful reaction to the events of someone's life. And there's lots of evidence to support this, lots and lots of evidence that if you are in difficult circumstances, if you're poor or struggling with housing problems, financial problems, employment problems, relationship problems, you're more likely to be depressed than if you're not. If you have a history of bad things happening to you in the past, such as child abuse, you're more likely to get depressed. And that's our intuitive that was our intuitive understanding of depression before the pharmaceutical industry came along and told us, no, you need to understand it in terms of brain chemicals. It's caused by it.
Yes.
We're going to look in the brain. That's what's going to explain to us what depression is. So we've got mixed up. We're looking in the wrong place. In my book, I use the analogy of a painting like the Mona Lisa. Trying to understand depression by looking in the brain is like trying to understand what the picture of the Mona Lisa is by looking at the canvas or the paint.
Right.
That's never going to show you that this is a picture of a woman with an ambiguous smile. for that, you need to stand back. You need to see the whole thing, and that's what depression is. It is a reaction of a whole human being to their particular individual and unique circumstances. Now, there are situations where things go wrong in the brain and do influence our emotions. That does happen. So if you get a brain disease, a really nasty brain disease like Parkinson's disease or dementia or multiple sclerosis, for example, these conditions can affect people's emotional states, particularly as they become more advanced. People with Parkinson's disease, for example, get into a sort of depressive state. They show more apathy, really, than low mood, but nevertheless, it can be quite like a depression. Another case of depression. But I would say that's an exceptional state, and there's a pathological basis to that. You can cut the brain open and see that there are bits of the brain that are abnormal in Parkinson's disease, and there is a very characteristic abnormality in Parkinson's disease, and in MS as well, although it was much more difficult to detect in MS. And of course, these conditions are also related to, they're generalized neurological conditions of the brain, so they cause physical symptoms and cognitive decline as well. So there are situations where our emotions are affected by specific brain mechanisms, brain pathologies. But in general, I think that's the wrong way to understand emotions. That's not to say that what's going on in our brain is disconnected from our feelings. Of course, there are things going on in our brain when we feel depression or joy or anxiety or any other feeling. But it's not necessarily the case that it's the same time each time you have that feeling, or it's the same in each individual.
Right. And that makes sense.
An example of this is, we know that you will get an arousal, a response, a fight or flight response, which is associated with the release of adrenaline in many different sorts of emotional states.
Yeah.
You will get that when you're angry, when you're anxious, when you're being aggressive, when you're surprised, and when you're feeling elated. All those very different emotional states can be associated with the same chemical reactions. So hence, you can't understand the meaning of the emotional state by looking at the chemistry. The meaning is to be found at the level of the person by looking at what is that person reacting to.
It makes complete sense to me, honestly. When I was looking through the book and reading it, I think there's a lot of the picture, and you would admit that we just don't understand, and it's still a black box. But what you say does make sense to me. Do you think that there's a role of serotonin in your model? I mean, our common knowledge of serotonin is that it's a neuromodulator. It acts to change and regulate the activity of circuits, and it does seem intricately related with mood. So that's, I guess, why it's an intuitive idea as well that serotonin is involved in low mood.
Yeah.
How do you think serotonin does fit into that picture?
So I looked at the serotonin, all the research on serotonin in detail when I was writing the book, and came to the conclusion that yes, there's serotonin in the brain. It's probably involved in a lot of things, but actually we've got no evidence that it has any specific role in anything other than probably sexual function.
Interesting.
The evidence on the role of serotonin in appetite or in sleep or in cognition is highly unreliable, highly inconsistent, really doesn't add up to anything at all. That's not to say that people haven't tried to get it to add up. So people that have written overviews of the evidence on serotonin and cognitive functions, for example, have tried very, very hard to find some theory that fits around all this completely inconsistent evidence. But the bottom line is the evidence is inconsistent. One study shows one thing and another shows something that looks as if it's completely opposite.
Right. These things are very hard.
Just a failure of replication, basically.
Right. these things are very hard to study. Like, I think another neuromodulator that just has so much misinformation out there is dopamine, by just sheer ability to measure and understand the incredibly complex things that these neuromodulators that affect circuit level dynamics, what they're really doing. And it's, dopamine, two dopamine researchers will tell you a completely different thing about what dopamine's function in the brain is.
Yeah.
We think we kind of take these neurochemicals, which would be the words that most people know, we assume that we understand what they do, but they actually somehow have the most confusion around them. And I have literally had two dopamine researchers on the podcast who would completely disagree with each other in terms of a fundamental role of dopamine.
Yeah.
I find that very interesting in and of itself.
I mean, I just think we know much less about these things than we think we do. We probably know more about dopamine than most other brain chemicals, because it is selectively lost in Parkinson's disease, and because we have L-DOPA, which is its precursor, which is a pretty similar molecule, and we can give people L-DOPA and observe the effects. So we know something about dopamine. We know that it's involved in movement and cognition. But even that is not as clear cut as you might think, because actually by the time Parkinson's disease is affecting your cognition, it's almost certainly affecting lots of other brain systems as well as the dopamine system. So it's not just, its effects don't just reflect what's happening with dopamine. And the serotonin in particular is, it's all over the brain. It's involved in, or it's transported all over the brain. It's involved in all sorts of brain processes. So yes, of course, it will be involved in mood. It will be involved in cognition, or at least it will be involved in what we do and think when we are in a state that we identify in that way. But that's a bit like saying blood is involved. There's blood all over the brain, and or like saying that we need a brain to feel depressed. It's that doesn't get us anywhere. Just saying that serotonin is involved in lots of things doesn't move us any further forward. Yes, it's in the brain. It's involved in lots of different processes. But to move forward, we need evidence that it has a specific role in specific situations, such as low mood. And that's what we don't have for anything, as I say, other than sexual function, where it seems that, and this is mostly from drug studies, and drugs are never completely selective. So even this isn't perfect evidence, but drugs that enhance serotonin activity cause sexual dysfunction. Drugs that suppress serotonin activity generally cause increased sexual activity.
Interesting. Yeah, it's one of the most consistent findings of doing this podcast is that we don't know anything about the brain. And I find it's the biggest experts and the people that I expect to just have like all the answers and all the wisdom oozing out are the people that just are first to admit that, we put up their hands and say, it's like, we're doing our best, but it's bloody complicated. There's a lot to figure out. What do you think the evidence says for the genetic basis of depression?
I mean, I don't know that in a lot of detail, so I'm just giving you an answer off the top of my head. I should caveat my answer with that. I think it's not unlikely that there is some genetic component to our general personality, and that would include our proclivity to depression or anxiety or other sort of extreme mood states, emotional states, or indeed to sort of emotional sensitivity in general. But I would say that the effects of genetics are overwhelmed by the very clear effects of someone's environment, and likely to be much less important than the effects of what has happened to you in your life and what is happening to you now.
Yes, I can tell you, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what came up when I was researching this for this episode. So I think twin studies generally give very good data on heritability. By comparing identical twins and non-identical twins, you can generally get a pretty good idea of the effect of genetics in the variance of a trait. So twin studies show heritability of about 35 to 40%, which actually isn't that high. People are going to say that's a really high number. It's actually not. Most personality traits are around 50%, and the average over all personality traits is 50%. Some things such as weight are as high as 70, which really surprised me.
Gosh, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I had Dr. Robert Plomin on the podcast, who's kind of the expert on these things.
Yeah.
It's highly polygenic. Polygenic meaning multiple genes. I think that's pretty obvious. There's no single candidate gene, and any sort of attempt to find one, I think, is doomed to failure. I think anyone who assumes something as complicated as depression can be caused by a single gene is vastly underestimating the complexity of the brain, as we were discussing. Some of the associations that have come up under using GWAS, genome-wide association studies, which is basically looking at a massive amount of genomes, and I'm curious what you think about this. So there's some genes involved in synaptic plasticity, some glutamate and calcium channel signaling, and some overlap with genes for neuroticism, anxiety, bipolar, and sleep disorders. So those are kind of the candidate associations that have come up, but absolutely nothing is concrete, except that it's polygenic, I think, is the most concrete thing. What would you say about those?
So that's really interesting, and I know the literature on the genetics of schizophrenia a little bit better than I do on depression, and I would just say from that the quotes, the figure that is quoted for heritability based on twin studies is taken from a single twin study that found by far and away the highest rate of heritability, and there are other twin studies that found much lower rates of heritability. So I just think we need to be aware that the sort of headline figures about the heritability rates may be inflated. Often people are overlooking studies that show much more modest rates, although, as you point out, actually 40% isn't that high anyway. And probably, given what I said about, we would expect some sort of heritability of personality traits, not that surprising. The genome-wide association studies, as with other mental health problems, identify a large number of genes that have a very, very small effect.
Yeah.
Potentially have a very, very small effect. And it's always unclear to me whether whether that really means anything. So, if you've got a gene that means that you have a 0.0001% higher chance than you would have done in the first place, that's just saying we're all different. Yeah, of course, we all have different genes.
I guess something that it's indicative of is, what it's saying is, don't oversimplify this. It's kind of giving a signal that it's complex, which sort of shies you away from overly simplistic diagnoses like deficiency in serotonin. I guess is something you could take from it.
And one of the areas of research we looked at in our serotonin paper was the genetic research on the serotonin transporter gene. Now that was instructive about how research gets reported. So there was lots of excitement in the 1990s when the SSRIs had come out and people were looking at the serotonin system, that maybe depression was caused by a flaw in this gene for the serotonin transporter. And so studies were done to look at that. And some of the studies suggested that, yes, there might be an effect. Then they did more studies and they didn't really show an effect. Bigger and better studies showed smaller and smaller effects. Then in the noughties, there was an idea, I think it was 2003, was a very famous paper published suggesting that it wasn't just a faulty gene. What was happening was an interaction between the faulty gene and childhood adverse life events in childhood. So some studies came out around that time suggesting that there was an association between the gene and depression, but only in people who had adverse life events in childhood. Several bigger and better studies were done over the course of the next 10 and 15 years. And by the time we get to the 2020s, we've got huge studies being published that are very high quality using gene data banks from all over the world, which show absolutely definitively that there is no effect of the serotonin gene and no effect of an interaction between the gene and adverse life events on depression, but they all showed that adverse life events were very strongly associated with your future risk of getting depression. So that's just I think it's just useful to highlight that as an example of how science goes. People get very excited about an idea. 1 or 2 positive studies come out suggesting, yes, this might be the case. We might have found the cause of depression or the gene for depression. And then bigger and better studies show smaller and smaller effects. But often people aren't aware that those bigger and better studies have disproved the initial hypothesis. So you still get people talking about the idea of a gene life events interaction for depression as if that idea had not been disproven.
Right.
Then I wanted to comment on what you said about the gene association studies detecting genes for neuroplasticity and for glutamate activity. I mean, these are one of numerous alternative biological hypotheses about the mechanisms of depression. I am as skeptical about them as I am about the serotonin hypothesis. I have looked at the research, but not in as much detail as I've looked at the serotonin research. The research on glutamate is highly inconclusive.
Right.
Certainly not more convincing than serotonin. The research on neuroplasticity, it's difficult to quite know what you should be looking for that. But again, the findings are not that compelling, and the idea that SSRIs or antidepressants enhance neuroplasticity or counteract some defect in neuroplasticity is, I would say, unlikely or unsupported by the evidence that we currently have, if you look at it in detail. And even if it was the case that SSRIs were associated with increased markers of neuroplasticity, that might indeed mean that they were doing damage to the brain rather than being something that's beneficial to the brain, because we know that after people have had a stroke or a brain injury, they show signs of increased neuroplasticity. The brain is responding to an injury by growing new connections. So even if we had evidence that antidepressants were associated with markers of increased neuroplasticity, that's not necessarily a good thing. That might actually be evidence that they're doing something harmful to the brain. But I would say that overall, we don't have evidence that they're affecting that. There's a very good review of animal studies looking at this data, which concludes that that the evidence is very weak and inconsistent.
Right. It does seem, at least, like some people just have to work a lot harder to maintain good, positive mental health. Do you believe that there is some biological predisposition? If you take, I know that, this whole nature versus nurture debate, it's all about interactions between, as we were talking previously. But if you were to say, like, is there a biological predisposition? Like, do you have any sense of what that might be? Do you have any sense of what contribution it might be biologically? Because I just, even from my life, I have so many incidences of knowing people very personally, and their life environment is good. They grow up in Dublin. They get all of the best opportunities. Maybe there's always stuff I don't know. There may be some traumatic event that I don't know of, but it seems like everything is there, yet they're hopelessly depressed and they've had stints on SSRIs. And whereas, like, looking at my case, like, I had a lot of physical health problems growing up. I was in and out of hospital a lot. And I wouldn't say that I identified at any point with being even remotely depressed. And I don't know why that is. And I'm not trying to say that in a boastful way, or I just like, I had a faulty heart, but my mental health always seemed positive. It didn't seem hard for it to be positive. Mm-hmm. And I always sort of attributed that to my mom, who I always my mom is the most positive, optimistic person in the world, proper Irish mammy type, where she'd be looking out the window and the earth would be splitting in two and lava would be coming up, and she'd make some comment like, "God, the weather, the sun's very nice there, isn't it? It's going to come out. Maybe we'll have a barbecue later." That's just who she is, and I've always attributed my positive disposition to her.
Well, isn't that interesting? Because I think you're highlighting the difficulty of this area. I mean, first of all, to say, yes, of course, people are different. And people start off as different. You know, we're all biologically individual. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if there is some biological predisposition to the sort of outlook that we have. But I think you've really neatly highlighted the difficulty of disentangling the effects of your environment from the effects of your genes. You know,
Yes.
Your mother has given to you both the genes, her genes, and an environment in which there was an optimistic outlook on life.
Yes, absolutely.
And both of those things have probably contributed to, you know, to making you more mentally robust and you know, having a more positive disposition than some other people have.
Yeah. I'm going to have to change.
Yeah, and I just think it's. I personally don't think we'll ever be able to pinpoint what it is that makes people different in this regard, because it's not one thing. You know, one person who has a tendency to depression is different from another person who has a tendency to depression.
Of course.
Same with people who, you know, lack that tendency or have more of a sunny disposition, like himself and your mother.
What do you think? How should we be prescribing treatments for depression under this model that you have, which is it's very complex, it's fiercely independent on the individual? Like, how should psychiatrists be working with patients? How should people at home listening that maybe do have negative thought patterns, negative moods more than they'd like, or even perhaps they're on SSRIs now, how do you think they should think about what they're feeling, how they should deal with their psychiatrists? Kind of talk about that.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So in general, I think that one of the problems with how we've been thinking about depression is we think of it as a condition that, and we try and treat the condition rather than try and help the individual. If we think of depression as the emotional reaction of a person, an individual person, then I think it becomes obvious that what we need to do is try and help that person to address whatever it is that is making them depressed. They may not know what that is, so the first job might be to help them try and identify what that is and what can be done about it. And so psychological therapy can be useful for that, to try and help people explore why they're feeling as they do, and what they can do to change it, as well as, you know, for other reasons, maybe to help people process things that have happened in their past that have made life difficult for them. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. I think it depends on the person. You know, someone who is depressed because they have financial difficulties or relationship problems, the financial difficulties and the relationship problems are what need to be fixed.
Right. Not
the person's brain chemistry, or the person's cognitive mindset either. So that's the general approach that I think we should take. Now, I think there are some people that feel that that's all very well for some people, but if depression is really severe, or if it's a case where you feel there may be some biological predisposition, then there must be a physical treatment. Now, what I would say is that the evidence that we have that our current physical treatments are helpful in those situations is very slim. So it's not the case that we must have a current physical treatment just because there may be some situations in which there is a biological component to someone's depression, or just because some cases are, you know, severe and unlikely to respond to lifestyle changes or psychological therapy. The studies on antidepressants do not show that they are significantly more effective in people who have severe depression, really severe depression, than people who have less severe depression. In fact, in people with really severe depression in inpatient studies, their effects seem to be very minimal. And then there's ECT to consider. Now ECT, for people who don't know, I'm sure most people do know, but ECT is putting an electric current through the brain to induce an epileptic fit, something that was introduced in the 1930s initially for people with schizophrenia, but then was increasingly applied to people with depression, and it is still used occasionally for people with severe depression, particularly psychotic depression. Now, ECT is doing something very profound to the brain. It can sometimes induce a temporary state of euphoria and indifference, which will temporarily obscure people's underlying feelings and lift them out of whatever depressive state they were in. The trouble is its effects don't last or haven't been shown to last, and so people gradually sink back into the state of depression that they were in before, although it might be a bit improved because they might have made some natural progression over that time anyway. And I've worked with many senior psychiatrists who are very, very mainstream, very biologically orientated, who nevertheless feel that putting electricity through the brain is not something that that we should be doing, that the benefits do not outweigh the adverse effects of doing that. So I would say that even in cases of very severe depression, the physical interventions that we have are not particularly beneficial and can have some profoundly harmful effects, like ECT can rob people of memory for years afterwards. And therefore, the way that we should treat severe depression is to look after people until they naturally get better. Look after people, gently encourage and support people, talk to people when they're able to have conversations. And most people, almost everyone, if they don't have an underlying neurological condition that the depression may be an early sign of, most people will recover from their depressive episode naturally in the end.
I'm really curious.
So I think what I'm saying is that we need to have a principle of first do no harm, and acknowledge that people can recover from depression spontaneously. So we should not be going in there with interventions that actually make people worse or give people not only their depression but long-term side effects to contend with as well.
Right. There's one that you missed. I mean, there's a lot of things, but one big one that you missed there, which in my head, it kind of even jives with your idea and your model, and I'm really curious to get your thoughts on it, which is psychedelics. Like, what's your opinion on the future of mental health treatment in relation to psychedelics?
So, psychedelics obviously are mind-altering drugs, and they were first introduced for this idea of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So the idea was that you would have a psychedelic-induced experience, a trip, and then you would discuss that with a therapist, and that you might gain insights into your life through that experience that would help you to overcome depression, anxiety, alcoholism. This has also been used for, and PTSD.
Yeah.
Now, theoretically, I can see some sense in that. Having said that, I think that we need to acknowledge that some people, that people can get insights through other means. I don't think you necessarily need to take a psychedelic to get a profound insight into life. You could do it by having a walk in the countryside, climbing a mountain, doing some sporting activity, dancing, listening to music. Lots of other activities can give us insights. But some people, I'm not denying that some people may have useful experiences or feel that they understand something important during a psychedelic experience. And
right.
although we should remember that some people find psychedelic experiences unpleasant, some people have bad trips, it's not a harmless procedure.
Yes.
I was approached by someone after I gave a talk recently who worked in a secure unit where there was someone who had killed his mother following an ayahuasca trip in a paranoid state after that trip. So, you know, so I think we should be aware that this is not a harm-free, always positive procedure.
Of course.
But yes, in theory, that's you know, a model that might work for some people. I accept that. My concern is that having a few psychedelic assisted experiences and a bit of psychotherapy is not a good business model. And the way that this has evolved with ketamine in the United States is that the therapy element has more or less been discarded, and people just go for regular ketamine injections. And yes, you know, taking ketamine might, like getting drunk, might make people feel a bit better for a few hours. Maybe the effects last a few days because of the sort of expectancy effects. But it doesn't cure anyone, so they keep going back for more. And it is also, there's also a dependency effect, and lots of harmful effects associated with taking long-term repeated ketamine injections. So that's my concern, is that the model will tend towards repeated use, repeated long-term use, because that's where profit is to be made. And we do not know, for psychedelics particularly, we really don't know about the potential effects, including possible negative effects of long-term use.
Would you agree that I think everything you said there is, I agree with it. Would you say that ongoing ketamine usage is probably better tolerated and safer than ongoing SSRI administration with what we know at the moment?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one.
Right.
I mean, they're both unsafe in different ways, would be my view. You know, ketamine use causes, I mean, we know this from the recreational drug scene, but the doses that are given, even with S-ketamine, are not far off what would be used recreationally. And we know that repeated use can cause bladder problems, you know, sometimes very significant bladder problems, that there are potential heart complications, and accidents related to dissociation, and that people can get depressed and suicidal when they're coming down from ketamine or during the withdrawal phase. So I think there are lots of hazards associated with long-term ketamine use. There are hazards associated with long-term SSRI use, particularly dependence and withdrawal problems, and really, and those are not trivial. Some people can really find the process of withdrawal very difficult and debilitating, and the symptoms can go on for years and years. And then, of course, there's the sexual dysfunction and persistent sexual dysfunction that we've talked about, as well as other effects that are probably a bit less common, but still significant. So I think it's difficult.
It's a political answer.
Difficult to come out with a winner.
Yes, I understand. I was just curious. This one's definitely gonna. I think you might be uncomfortable answering this one if the last one was got you political. And I know this is going to be impossible to say outright, but I'm curious on your instinct. Do you think the world would be a happier place if SSRIs were never invented?
That's not a difficult question at all. I think that overall they are definitely doing more harm than good.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, you know, the evidence is they have minimal or no benefit, and they have a whole array of adverse effects, particularly in people who are taking them long term, that we've underestimated.
Wow. Joanna, I could go for hours. This has been so enjoyable and such an important conversation. I think Chemically Imbalanced is an amazing book. Really, really interesting, really well written. So many interesting use cases of people that have fallen into antidepressants and ended up in really bad places. Just in general, I think a really important book for people to read. So I'll link it down below. it's been amazing having a conversation with you. I would love to get on again. Perhaps having a conversation with two people and where someone is possibly in favor of the serotonin hypothesis. I would love to see that back and forth and dialogue. And again, I just think your message is incredibly important. So thank you so much. And it's really been a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you, Evan. It's been a pleasure to come on. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Joanna. Definitely a more controversial episode, but an incredibly important topic that I think it's very crucial to have conversations around. So leave your comments below how you think about that entire conversation, because I'm really curious. If you're interested in more depression, mental health, then Dr. Nicholas Fabiano is an amazing psychiatrist. He is prescribing exercise for depression, and he looks into loads of interesting studies on creatine. Check that episode out below. Subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for the support.